Welcome, everyone. We'll wait another minute or so and then we'll get started. And I just saw a question in the chat about whether or not this recording will be shared. Yes, everyone will receive the recording after the webinar. So I'll just answer that up front. You're welcome. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us for our Orchestrate webinar today. If you're not familiar with Intecrowd, we're a full service Workday partner and our team holds over 1,000 Workday certifications. We offer initial deployment, phase X, and post-production support for HCM, financials, adaptive planning, integrations, extend, and more. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit those via the Q&A feature, and we'll take some time to answer them at the end. With that, I'll pass it over to Brent to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Taryn, and welcome, everybody. Excited to be here with you all today to talk about orchestrations. As a brief introduction of myself, I'm going to go ahead and tell you I'm Brent Pappenfuss. I am living here in West Palm Beach, Florida, and a lot of times we have these slides and we put up pictures of ourselves on them, but you can see me right now on camera. So I figured I'd share a little bit about things I love, which I love aquatic wildlife, part of the reason I live where I do. And so here's some recent pictures I took that are obviously cuter than I am. So enjoy that. I'm one of our Extend product leads here at Intecrowd, and I'm excited to talk about orchestrations, specifically Orchestrate for integrations and the benefits it can have for you, what it is, just all about it, and just give a pretty brief overview over the whole thing because, it is a newer thing. A lot of people have questions about it. We're hoping to be able to answer those questions. And like Taryn said, if you have questions as we go, do feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll get to them as we can. And with that, we'll roll right into things. So what are orchestrations? Simply put, they are a series of steps to get from points A, B, and C to points D, E, and F. And when I originally wrote that line, I was going to say to get from point A to point B, but that wasn't really fully indicative of the power behind them, is that orchestrations are something you can use to pull in data from one or more sources, and you can then take that data, manipulate it, do things with it, get it to the shape that you want it to be in, and then send it to one or more locations. And it's not even necessarily just that start and end pattern either. It's a variety of patterns that can be done. And this tool was originally made for Workday Extend, because within Workday Extend, we had the need to be able to do a lot of this data manipulation and send out things to external APIs as well as Workday's web services. And orchestrations were a way to handle that. And at DevCon 2023, we actually got a heads up that was going to be expanding to integrations, that the orchestration framework was going to be usable there as well. And obviously, that's very exciting. What I just described is kind of a big major use case of integrations in general is taking data, manipulating it, sending it somewhere else, and maybe doing some other stuff in between. So that was very exciting. And by the end of that year, we were getting into a little preview where a lot of us could go in and mess around with them a little bit. And at the beginning of 2024, that opened up to be within limited access and for clients and customers in general. So with these orchestrations, we're able to interact with files, with Workday APIs, and with third-party APIs. And these could be inbound connections, outbound connections, a combination of them. We can have boomerang orchestrations, all the types of things that you would normally talk about when figuring out what kind of integration you need to build. And it's a very powerful tool. And like I said, it's available in limited access right now. There's an enablement form that you fill out and can get access to it quickly, which we'll go over that at the end of this as well. But it's also going to be generally available starting next year with the 2025 R1 release. So if you don't have access to orchestrations yet, and you don't necessarily have a need to touch them immediately, you can wait for that. But if you come out of this webinar thinking, well, I've got things that would be useful for this, and I'd like to get started right away, that is an option, and we'll help you out with that piece right there. So I want to show off what they look like a little bit here to give you an idea of what they actually are and how they actually are used. So we have right here the developer console is what we call this. And this developer console is something that is used to develop Extend apps and also orchestrate for integrations, orchestrations. So in here, I've got an integration app is what we call it. And I have the ability to add an orchestration. So once the general availability or once you're enabled for this, you're going to have access to the same screen. You're going to be able to see the same things I do right here. And we can come in, we can add an orchestration. I'm going to show you what really is special about these orchestrations. So I have an option. I can make an integration one, or I can have one trigger off a business process instead. We're just going to go with the basic, have a Workday integration system tied into it. And we'll just say that the orchestration name is webinar example, like that. And it's going to create for me a interface right here where we can add things to this orchestration to do whatever we want. Right now, all it's doing is starting and ending and nothing in between, but we want it to be able to do something. And so we have a variety of components that are going to let us do a variety of different things. And for the purposes of this demonstration, we'll just do a real quick, simple one here. We have add integration message. So we'll have an integration, we'll have it run, and we'll add a message here saying, here is what you typed. And the detail of that, this is where they get fun, is that we can come in here and we can add just simple text here, of course, but we also have the ability to add elements from elsewhere in the orchestration. These steps can reference one another so that we can get the data we want, take it, turn it into something else, shoot it back somewhere else. So in this case, we're going to grab a simple data string right here, and this is part of an LP, launch parameter. So when we create our integration system in the tenant, which we'll do, we're going to be able to use a launch parameter to send something in here. And we're just going to grab that and we're going to send it right back to ourselves. So what you'll see in here that I'm interfacing, the way I'm interfacing, and here's something special about orchestrations, is they're very low code. This is something that has a lot of power, a lot of functionality, and a lot of flexibility. And you don't really need to know much coding to be able to get started with it. Now, if you're doing something very complex, you might and probably will. And that's why we're here, to be able to help with the more complex things. But all I'm doing right here, just grabbing a launch parameter, grabbing simple data. If you didn't know that that's what it was called, documentation can help you out there. And we're going to tell this that we're going to be looking for the message launch parameter, just message with capital M right there. And that will be what we're going to reference in our integration system. So all I did, again, I added a step for integration message because I want an integration message. That's my purpose in this orchestration. I added a summary so that the message has a summary. It is required. And then for detail, I reference a launch parameter that is a simple type named message. And that's it. I'm going to hit save. We now have a completely functional orchestration. We're going to deploy that into our tenant. And while that's deploying, because that could take a minute or two, we're going to pop over to the tenant itself. And here comes part two, is that each integration or each orchestrate for integrations setup requires both the orchestration and the integration system to be able to work. We're just going to go to our create integration system task. And in here, we'll just call this BJP webinar example. And you'll see we've got our template. If you're familiar with making integrations, this will not be anything new to you. But in here, if you are enabled, we'll have a new template called orchestrate integration template. And we'll go ahead and hit OK on that. And there we go. So in here, there's a few things we got to do, but real quick, I'm just going to pop back over here. Build's still going. Okay, just wanted to make sure it was still doing its thing. All right, so we're going to go in here and we're going to, first of all, edit our integration attributes. There's not many steps you have to do, but this is the key one right here, is that we have to go into our attributes and we have to fill out the orchestration name and the application reference ID. The application reference ID is conveniently located on the top level of the app right here. So I'm just going to copy that. Again, this is in our developer console, which everyone will have access to in the near future. And then we will add that in right there. We could do environment restrictions if we need to, but we don't need to in this case. And then we'll grab our orchestration name, which is just webinar example. And it looks like the build is finished. So we're going to go ahead and hit the deploy button as well to get it into our tenant. Make sure that authenticates okay. Okay, good. And then back over here, orchestration name. So this is how it knows to talk to each other. Is the integration system just has to know what the application ID is and what the orchestration name is. As long as it has those two pieces of information, the connection is complete. So we hit OK. Now, the last thing we need in order to be able to run this is that I did specify that I'd be getting details out of a launch parameter. So we're going to add one. I'm going to go to my related actions. And while I'm doing this, I just do want to point out that while this is technical stuff, technically speaking. We will have other things to show off about these as well. It won't all be technical in case anyone's getting sick already from seeing me click around and hear too much. But as for the code side of it, again, I want to point out that yes, it's technical, but it's no more technical than operating anything else in Workday. It's very, very straightforward and easy to be able to get in and start doing something. So we're going to come in here, the launch parameter, we're naming it message because that is what we called it right here. That's what we're referencing. And for data type, we're just going to put in text because we just need plain text data to be able to be brought in. And we're going to hit OK. And there we go. So assuming that everything is all set up now, webinar, go back to this. So we've got our attributes set up for webinar example and the name of our application. We've got our launch parameter for message set up. In our orchestration, we've got our integration message set up referencing that launch parameter. So we're going to go ahead and launch it. Integration, launch schedule. We'll go ahead and run this right now. And we'll just go ahead and say, hi, everyone, as our message. And we will hit OK. All right. And then if we refresh, we see it's already done. There wasn't a lot of steps in there, so not much to do. So that's obviously a very, very quick orchestration. We see here's what you typed. And there's our message that we just typed in. Hi, everyone. So with this, I hope that I can convey one of the great things about this is that these orchestrations can be very flexible as to what you want to be put in and dynamic with it as well. So if we need dynamic information to be fed into these, that's not a problem. So we can, I just did text in this case. That's just a simple little example. But if we needed to pull in information from business objects in here that also exist in Workday, we'd be able to do that too. So if we needed to choose a pay period, for example, we'd be able to set up a launch parameter for pay period and be able to pass that through to the orchestration for it to reference for what it needs to do. So there's a lot of steps in here, and I'm certainly not going to go through all those steps on this because that's a whole series of tutorials and classes on its own. But as for all the things it can do in here, which I will say, Workday has magnificent tutorials when it comes to orchestrations. They've got a really good set out there on the Learning Center in case you're interested in the more nitty gritty of that. But as just a few examples we can see here, we see that we've got API requests. So if we needed to send in a Workday web service, either SOAP or REST, and we can do WQL calls as well, we'd be able to set those up and get information in and out of the system. So that obviously that's very key. In addition, we have just HTTP requests in general, where we can interface with any third-party API, so long as it has the capability for us to do so, of course. And that'll let us take information in and out of their system, in and out of Workday, and intermingle them together, just like we would be doing in, say, a Studio orchestration, normally speaking. So we have the ability to trigger business processes. We can trigger PDF generation via BERT. We can create wholly new pieces of data. So for those of you that may be more familiar with XSLT, we have text templates now. So you don't need to learn XML and XSLT nitty-gritty details in order to get into this. You just have to be able to know how to pull in a few types of functions within Workday's own orchestration text templates. And it's overall a much simpler process, a lot fewer types of syntax and everything to know. You just need to know a few things, reference data, bam, you're good to go. So we're using those instead of XSLT here. We have the ability to create values, which are basically variables that live inside the orchestration and can be called back to at any point. We can store documents right onto the integration system. So any files that we output that we need to have delivered, store them on the integration system, they get delivered on. And then we have a lot of logic steps here, and I won't go too far into those, but if we need to have branching conditions, we have the ability to do that. As you can see right here, this will open up things into two different paths that I can go down based on logic I define. If we've got a whole list of data to iterate through and need to perform some type of action on every person in that list, which is very common when it comes to integrations like this, then we have a loop component that's going to let us go through each of those pieces and perform the steps we need to do on each individual one. There is so much flexibility within what can be done here. And this is something that is obviously going to be very big in your decision-making process when it comes to how you're going to build and request build of integrations. And so with that, of course, the question is when should you use them? And to answer that, so we've got a little bit of a decision tree here. This is the back half of the decision tree. If you've not seen the decision logic that Workday has out on community, basically it's going through and saying, does this even need any automation in general, or is it simple enough? If it does need automation, can we do it with like just interfacing with the APIs? If we can't just use the APIs, can we get by with a connector? So on and so forth, until we land on the custom section here. So this is for cases where none of the delivered methods are going to be able to fully do what we need them to do. And none of the APIs, well, they may be good, and we will be using APIs with it certainly, but those APIs may not be an option to be accessed directly by the vendor or customer. So that's when we fall into custom. So many of you should be familiar with EIBs already, and just a straight up EIB without XSLT, not a big deal. That's a bit more intense than connectors can be in some cases, but overall, it's one of the simpler ways to go about a custom. And before we had orchestrations, the next step would be EIB with XSLT, meaning that we would take the report output that we'd get from the EIB and apply custom transformations to it in order to get the data the way that we needed to before sending it along. And XSLT is its own markup language and requires a good amount of knowledge to be able to use effectively, especially if you're trying to make it as efficient as possible. So there's definitely a big learning curve there with using XSLT. And then Studio, there's a major learning curve. That's a whole other program. That's a whole other set of things you're working with. And if you've never seen Studio, it's complicated. So we want to avoid Studio wherever we can. In some cases, we're going to need to. And orchestrations aren't replacing Studio. I want to make that clear. Some people see this as saying, okay, well, we won't need Studio ever again. We can just stick with orchestrations. And well, in your use cases, that may become true. There still may be some very complex specifics that Studio may be needed for. And we'll go over that in a little bit here in a second. But for the most part, we're going to be wanting to stick with orchestrations instead of using XSLT, instead of using Studio as much as we possibly can. And orchestrations will be able to meet that need. So if you're getting to the point where you're saying, well, none of the options that we have available to us via the delivered connectors or APIs alone are going to get us there, and we need to have this logic-driven integration built, then we've got the orchestration option to be able to do that. There's a lot of advantages over it, and I'm going to be mostly comparing it with Studio itself, because while, again, you're going to use it instead of EIBs with XSLT case in most cases as well, most of the use cases are going to be between these two right there as far as what their capabilities are. So it's important to know when you should use an orchestration and when you should use a Studio. And I want to point out again that orchestration is going to be the most common choice between those. So what are some of the advantages? Well, you just saw me using the interface, and I want to point out the interface I was just using is inside of a web browser, and that's accessible from anywhere where you have a web browser. You don't need to install anything special. You don't need to do all the configuration. If you've ever gone through the trouble of getting Studio installed, you know it is not the easy jaunt that you would like it to be. It requires a lot of steps and a lot to do. And for some of us, that may be, okay, whatever, we get it, but installing a program, but sometimes requires installing extra things along with it. But for some people, it's just a bit much. So first and foremost, it already saves time by just you having immediate access to it, not having to worry about what Java version you have installed and all that other stuff. Interface as well is just far simpler. I'm going to pull up an orchestration again real quick here. Okay. So this is the same one we were looking at. And you can see, there's a lot going on here, sure, but it's all laid out really well. It's very clear where things go. It's got these nice big things saying, please drag something here, right here. We'll do something with it. It's very well laid out and very easy to navigate around it. And if you've never seen a Studio before, here is what they look like. And first of all, they're big. There's a lot of things that go into them. This is one that I'm using to update a little bit of worker information for somebody. And just right away, it's much more everywhere is the best way I can put it, is that your components aren't really nice and cleanly laid out. You try your best. You use these swim lanes here to try to get everything nicely in a row, but you got to drag these arrows everywhere. You've got to create even more swim lanes. Every time you want to lay things out, you create another swim lane. You want this to appear vertically in here, create another swim lane. Those things are happening automatically in orchestrations. You don't do anything with them. There's no need to do extra steps just to connect in the layout. You're skipping all that, which is great, because you could say, well, in Studio, maybe I just skip all that. Maybe I don't need to have them laid out well. And you'll quickly find that's not true. You want to make sure your studios are well laid out. Orchestration takes care of that for you, which is fantastic. In addition, there's just so many buttons all over the place. And this isn't even all the buttons there are, not even remotely. There are probably hundreds more buttons that I can have displaying that all do something and you may need at some point. So in general, much simpler to interface with an orchestration for sure. And as far as speed goes, that simpler interface leads into being faster to build. And for people building them, obviously that's a big boon. But for people who are asking us to build them, that should also be a bigger boon. So we're talking, we have a studio integration, let's say it takes about 120 hours for us to get through. They're not a small thing. They take a good chunk of time. For a similarly scoped orchestration, we're going to be quoting probably around 80 hours for that sort of thing. These are just ballpark estimates here. I'm not saying that's what you will get from us, but I'm saying that's the kind of savings we're seeing here. We're talking about going from 120 to 80 hours just by switching what technology we're using for the same type of result to get. So obviously that's a big advantage over Studio right there, is just how much simpler they are to build in the first place. And then as far as speed goes, running them is faster too. Studios have you can get a studio to be pretty efficient, but there's still going to be inherent startup times that are associated with it. And some of the steps in there can take a while to get through. Whereas orchestrations were built with that efficiency in mind and have a lot more tools available to make them speedier and snappier than a studio integration. And then just quite honestly, they're easier to maintain as well. Again, the simpler interface lends itself to that. If you get done with an engagement with us and you're like, well, darn, I needed to change this one word to this one other word somewhere, way easier to do that in an orchestration than it is to do that in a studio. You don't have to go and wait for the entire program to load. I mean, honestly, by the time Studio actually loads, I will have been able to make a change like that in an orchestration, just to give you an idea. So that's how that's how we're looking at that. So yeah, there's a lot of advantages to using an orchestration over a studio. Of course, there are still going to be cases where you may need a studio. These are going to be mostly edge cases. If you're just talking about sending a bunch of data outbound to one source, that's going to be an orchestration every time. If you're just receiving a file and using Workday Web Services to put that in, and there's not a whole bunch of manipulation needed, that's always going to be an orchestration. And if it gets more complex, then most of the time, yeah, you're still going to be using an orchestration, but more and more complex you get, the more and more likely you are to have to hit up using a studio instead. So I listed a few examples here of what those edge cases might be. So working with Excel specific files, so XLSX files, if instead of a CSV, for example, orchestrations can handle CSV files, no problem. But when it comes to Excel, it isn't able to directly open up those and work with those in the same way you would with the CSV. Similarly, if you are really going all out there and you have need of custom Java code, which most people don't. This is not a common thing for people to need by any means, but in some cases, there may be some intense studios that could require a little more external coding to make work. You're not going to be able to do that with an orchestration either. But again, these are edge cases, not something that you're going to see on a regular basis. So other thing I'll show you here. So I showed you what it looks like to just do a simple little orchestration that outputs a message. I wanted to talk about inbounds because this is where they are really, really useful for where we're often using them the most, is that orchestrations are able to pick up files just like any other integration can, and it's able to take those files and run different web services to get things to new places. And in this example here, I'm working with with incoming pay data, things that we need to create one-time payments for. And all we're doing is we're grabbing the file, we're taking it open with the CSV, and that file is provided to us in the vendor format, right? So that's what these first steps here is, just grabbing that file. And then the vendor format, they didn't give us employee IDs, and that's okay. We need employee IDs in order to update things, but they are giving us social security numbers, let's say. And so we can use a loop here to go through and say, well, we're going to match our list of social security numbers and employee IDs with their list of social security numbers, so we can get the employee ID for each person and assign it to the row for that pay input. And from there, we take all that data, we iterate through each row of the data, and then we put that into a file. We send that file to the Workday Web Services, and bam, we got pay inputs coming in, and it's perfect. And again, I'm going to scroll up and down here. This is all it takes to get a pay input file coming into Workday and populating those pay inputs. This is it. This is all there is there. That's not me saying that, there's not going to be unit testing involved and extra end-to-end testing. We still got work that we need to do and make it work. But as far as simplicity of maintenance goes, and as far as like once we've got the build in place, there's not a lot to look at anymore at that point, which is ideal, which is really what you want. So much easier to work with, much easier to maintain, and does the job faster than the studio. Most of the time, you're going to be wanting orchestrations. So the next question, obviously, is going to be, well, how can I get started with this, right? So as I mentioned before, the general availability for Orchestrate for integrations is going to be the 2025 R1 release early next year. But if you're coming out of this and you're saying, well, hold on, I've got an idea that I want to use with this. If you've got a solid use case, and if you're working with a Workday partner, such as Intecrowd, then there's an enablement form, and you can reach out to us and get that form, and we can work on filling it out with you. And I'm going to emphasize, Workday really likes it when the use case is very properly formatted and clear as to what it is. So make sure you work with us on putting in that use case. And once you submit that form, Workday checks every 2 weeks and will enable anyone that is a priority to enable. And having a solid use case and having a Workday partner is what makes you a priority enablement. So in most cases, we're getting people back enabled within 3 weeks and ready to start building integration orchestrations at that point. So it's a very straightforward process. Recommend that if you see benefit out of this, that to present to us that use case, and we've been more than happy to work on that with you. So that is about it as far as what I'm going to just keep yammering about here. So I think now would be a great time, Taryn, to turn to some questions.
Okay, we do have quite a few questions, Brent, and I just want to preface it with we will stay on a little bit after the end of the call to make sure we get to all the questions. So if you have to drop, you'll get the recording after the fact, and you can tune back into it to see what those questions are and what the answers are if you do have to drop. So the first question is, what is the main difference between an Extend app and an integration app?
That's a great question. So one thing I want to make clear is that those of you familiar with Extend know that the Dev Console is where we work with Extend applications as well. And orchestrations got their start as being meant for Extend applications. So Workday has divvied them out into 2 separate types of apps, because the other thing with Extend is that if you're on the standard SKU or if you're on the professional SKU, you have a limited number of applications you can build in Extend. You can build 3 on the standard, 10 on the professional. Integration apps do not count towards that, first and foremost. And that's because they don't contain a few things that Extend apps do. An integration app does not contain presentation components, so there's no pages associated with it. And it doesn't contain model components. So there's no data storage or business processes associated with it. So without those things on the application, it just counts as an integration app. And when you go to create these apps, you'll have that choice if you have orchestrations enabled. You could say, I want to create an orchestration, or you could say, I want to create an Extend app. So that's the difference there. There's just, you're only doing orchestrations inside of an integration app, whereas Extend will give you access to those presentation and model components as well.
Okay. Which programming language is used for Orchestrate?
So it's not really a specific programming language, because as often is with these types of things, it's kind of a flavor. So I am very familiar with JavaScript myself, and I would say it's very similar to JavaScript with some of the things you use in here, but you don't use it frequently. You use it for very specific circumstances. You'll notice, again, as I was going through this, that I wasn't typing any code. There is an expression language in there, and that expression language does technically have a text interface, but otherwise you're just clicking on pills and adding things to those pills, just basically connecting building blocks together to make it. So the expression language is set up similar to other scripting languages. So if you're familiar with scripting languages, then you'll be comfortable there, but there's not a specific language at play here. It's Workday's own interface that they put together, and they supplement it with the additional expression language options, as well as some options within the text templates too. So as far as what languages you can interface with, as far as the data goes, things, obviously CSV files, we already mentioned, XML files, JSON files, whatever types of data you're coming in, as long as it's can be represented in plain text, is going to be able to come in here. So there's no issues with whatever type of data you're coming in. Again, the only thing I would say to avoid is going to be Excel specific files, since those are kind of really their own thing.
Perfect. Okay. Is there an AI component to orchestration rather than drag and drop setup? Can it be created through natural language and have it done to a large extent?
Not yet. I'm going to say, and here's heavy safe harbor, is that there is nothing from Workday that I've heard has said that we're moving towards doing anything like that just yet. But obviously, if you've been paying attention, you know that Workday is all very big on AI. There are AI available APIs that can be accessed through orchestrations as well, depending on for if you've got the right SKUs enabled for that one. I want to, well, briefly state, orchestrations are free. There's not a paid SKU associated with them, but there are additional functionalities that may require things like the extend SKU if you're going to go that far. But for basic building of orchestrations, there's no need for an additional SKU. Everything I showed you today works in the basic SKU. So as far as having an AI come through and lay it out for you, no, there's not really anything like that at the moment. It'd be cool if that comes up. I know some people, because at the end of the day, an orchestration is technically a bunch of text, and so some people have been kind of throwing around ideas on how to auto generate things. But yeah, there's nothing there that's really going to replace the overall process at this point in time.
Okay. Does orchestration work with Prism?
Yes, it does. So Prism is normally interfaced just directly using its APIs that are available. And since orchestrations are able to interface with Workday and external APIs, we can put in the Prism APIs and it can pull and push information directly from Prism.
Great. Do we need extend in order to use orchestrate?
You do not. So the extend SKU obviously will come with orchestrations built into it, but orchestrate for integrations is a separate SKU. Funnily enough, if you have the extend SKU, that doesn't necessarily mean you have the orchestrate for integration SKU, and you won't be able to build integration apps without that. So you'll have access to orchestrations and extend apps, but you'll still need the separate orchestrate for integration SKU to be able to access those. Again, coming to everybody next year, coming to those who enable right now.
Okay. As an integration developer, is there a need to go to classes or is it intuitive enough?
I'm going to say that depends on your amount of experience. At the very least, I would say check out the tutorials. I mentioned them at the beginning here, but the tutorials up on the Learning Center, they're free. There's no cost associated with them. You just run through them. It'll help you build some orchestrations. If you're familiar enough with integrations in general, that's honestly more than enough to get started. If you're not as familiar with integrations, and especially if Studio is a new concept to you, then a class might be helpful, and Workday does offer classes for that. So I think for those of you who are developer minded, will probably have an okay time getting through orchestrations just by poking around, taking the tutorials, and viewing the documentation.
Okay, and there's two quick questions kind of following up with that. Is there a course available in Workday Learning, and are there tutorials available on Workday Community?
Yep. So the tutorials are on Learning. I want to point that out. Is previously they would have been on Community and the developer forum, but they've moved them all into Learning. So all the tutorials can be found right there. The course, same thing. You'll be able to find the actual course associated with orchestrations up there as well. I will say the courses have changed recently, so I don't want to say too much specific about them, because there may be differences from the last time I've seen it. And when I say recently, I mean like just a few weeks ago. The way Workday Learning courses work changed a little bit. So, but either way, the course is up there and should be able to be found.
Okay. Is Orchestrate expected to be a different SKU?
So it currently is, and it's going to be, but that SKU is going to just basically be defaultly enabled once the 2025 R1 release comes out. So yes, it is a different SKU. It does require having that SKU enabled right now through that enablement form, which again, check with your whoever your contact here at Intecrowd is, and they will be able to get you set up with filling that out, and you'll be able to get that in. So if you go and look for it right now and you haven't enabled, you won't see it. Not until if you don't do anything, you won't see it until next year.
Okay. If your inbound data source is a zip file, can Orchestrate allow you to run a script task to extract file contents?
Yes, orchestration does have the ability to go into compressed files and take files out of them. And then from there, once you have the file, it's just a matter of it running through like it would any other file.
Perfect. Sorry, we have quite a few more questions, so we're just going to keep going through them. I'm a longtime Workday Studio developer and have been using orchestrations for Extend for a while. In Studio, there is an option to execute steps when a condition is met. I have not found similar functionality with orchestrations. Is there a better pattern to use in orchestrations without having ever expanding branch on condition nodes?
That's a really good question. And let's see, give that a thought for a moment here to give you the best possible answer on that. Because what you've already declared is one of the more straightforward approaches to it. Again, you may have a variety, you may have a good amount of branching branches at that point, and I get the idea to not want to get into that. If it's going to require two different paths from occurring, you're going to need the branches, no matter what. It's if you have an else statement, you're going to need that. If there is only a need to just move forward if something is met, and you don't need to move forward otherwise, then you've got continue on conditions for that. If you're not already using that, that might be something to look into as well. You may already be using that, but that's for more if you just want to stop moving along that path altogether if a condition is not met. So those really are your main options there. So if you do have two different paths that need to be followed, you're going to be, yeah, you might get yourself into a bit of a branching nightmare. And here's my recommendation there. If one of your key concerns is visual cohesiveness, is utilize sub-processes. Sub-processes have been added to orchestrations in the last 3 months, I think. It wasn't that long ago. And we played around them a little bit at DevCon too. But the point is that with a sub-process, it's kind of like having those local outs and local ins in Studio. And those sub-processes, you can move them somewhere else. They can be repeatable. So if you want to enter the same sub-process twice, but pass along different parameters, that can help negate a little bit of the extra steps that you have to create. And those sub-processes are then available for any other orchestrations you create within the same integration app. And then least of which I would say about the benefits of it is that it can help keep things a little bit tidier if that is a concern for you and you want to have that more cohesive look to your orchestrations. So I would say look into that. If the other two options aren't doing everything you want right now, is look into just kind of moving things into sub-processes to be able to take care of those pieces as well, especially if you can reuse them. Reusing sub-processes is so handy. Like if you're just making multiple API calls, you don't technically need to have a million different API steps. You can have the one sub-processes that calls APIs and just pass it the parameters for which API it needs to use. So yeah, lots of options there.
Okay. If we get extend, what I think it's supposed to say, would the Copilot be a separate SKU?
Copilot is, last time I checked, only available on the professional extend SKU. So if you are getting the standard extend, it's not going to be something like that comes along with that. And that's true for the AI features in general. Most of the AI features are specific to professional. And I would say double check that with your Workday rep just to be safe, if that's still the case. But the last time I checked, which was pretty recently, that was where it's currently housed.
Okay. Can you add an orchestration step within an existing integration template, parentheses, CCW, business process?
Absolutely. So if you run this is the kind of thing you would do with a pre or post processor, right? Is that you have the business process for the integration kickoff and you got the data out of the connector, but you want to manipulate that data. So yes, one of the options we had, we made an integration orchestration at the beginning of this, but the other option is business process trigger. And so if we make that business process trigger, then we're going to be able to call that orchestration from another business process and have it kick off. Similarly, that's the main way to go about it. But similarly, you could also technically just add integration service step to the business process and call up an integration orchestration as well. Let's say that you have an orchestration that you want to be able to run manually or schedule, but also want it to run off a business process. Then yes, you can just call up that integration on the business process like you would any other integration and specify its launch parameters there.
Okay. Hello, thank you for the great demo. Is there any ability to create documents like supplier invoice using Orchestrate from Excel files?
Not from Excel files, unfortunately. Again, and I want to be clear here, is that some people's definition of Excel file is just a file that opens up in Excel, but I want to be extra clear that I'm specifically referring to actual XLSX files that Excel generates that are proprietary to it. Those files you're not going to be able to do much with inside of an orchestration right now. There might be some workarounds to work inside them. I'm going to recommend still using Studio in those cases. If it's instead a CSV file that houses all this information and not actually a true Excel file, that CSV file will work in an orchestration just fine. So the answer to that is it's going to depend on what the actual data type of the file is. But if it is truly an Excel file, you're going to be sticking with an orchestration you're going to be sticking with a Studio integration for getting details out of that.
Okay. A few more here. Will orchestration type integrations replace Workday Studio integrations in the future?
Replace is too strong a word, because one thing I want to make clear is that there shouldn't be a push to necessarily go out and replace all of your studio integrations with an orchestration. If your studio integrations are working just fine, you don't need any updates on them, and there's no continued maintenance that you're working with, they could probably stay where they are and not have any concerns with it. Workday has made no indication so far that the actual studio functionality is going away. So if the integrations are there, they're there. But where I would say they'd replace them is with making updates to existing studios, or of course, making brand new integrations. Is that you're going to be wanting to use this instead of Studio in most cases. And if your Studio, let's say that you need to make a significant enough change to where you're going to be spending a good chunk of hours updating the Studio integration, seriously consider how long it would take to just turn it into an orchestration at that point, because that would also mitigate additional development time on future maintenance as well. So yeah, again, no need to go out and hurry and replace studios. They're not going anywhere. But do trend towards orchestrations wherever possible, because that's going to be what ends up saving you the most time and be the most efficient.
Great. Okay. Do we have debugging available for orchestration like in Studio?
That's a great question. And this is going to be another big safe harbor, but I have heard through the grapevine that we should be seeing some debugging options coming to orchestrations in the near future. We don't have them at this moment in time, which has led me to create a lot of log files on every orchestration I built, but I'd prefer to have logging anyway, wherever I can. So there will be debugging. It's not available yet, and I don't have any idea on when it will be available, but I do know that is something that is being seriously considered. And yeah, so keep an eye out for that. You should be seeing more details on it soon.
Okay. Looks like we have two, maybe three more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Can orchestration perform change detection similar to core connectors?
The short answer is yes. There's going to be an asterisk on the end of that, of course. So orchestrations have the ability to pull in data from just about anywhere inside of Workday. And if that data is appropriately set up to where we can determine whether or not a change has occurred on it, which oftentimes we can get that, then yes, it will be able to do change detection in that way. We can set up specific launch parameters to help control that as well. So there may be some setup involved with that. One thing I might recommend is that question we had previous. If we've got a change detection integration and we just need some post processors on it, that's another thing you can do. Rather than trying to set up the change detection yourself, you can have it work off of another integration that already has that change detection in place. In addition, if you're able to set up that change detection at a report level, orchestrations, of course, are able to use RAS reports as well as DIS services, which reports can basically be turned into DIS services. So if you're able to set up that change detection inside of a report and pass it into an orchestration, then bam, you're good to go there too.
Okay. Can we have a separate orchestration like a function and being called from different main orchestrations?
That may have been asked before I talked about subprocesses, so I'll repeat myself a little bit here, just because they are neat. But yes, subprocesses are what you're talking about. A subprocess in an orchestration allows you to have specific functionality that can be repeated and called out to at any point in the orchestration. And that can again be used across all the orchestrations within one integration app. They can't be used between apps, but they can be used within the in the same app multiple times across the different orchestrations. And that's going to allow you again, to repeat the same thing, but you can add in different parameters that you pass into that subprocess. So every time you run it, again, my example was with web services. If you want to have the same sequence of steps every time you call a web service and you have multiple web services to call, pass in the specific payload and endpoint for that web service and let the subprocess then fill that in to the same sequence of steps you'd keep repeating. So yes, there are functions available in the form of subprocesses.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Brent. We will take one more question, and that is, can orchestration be scheduled on its own?
On its own is the key word there. So if you have made an orchestrate for integration like we did today, that can be scheduled. If you are on the extend SKU and only have access to extend orchestrations, those cannot be scheduled. That's a distinction there. That was a pain point for a long time in Extend. We'd have to build studio integrations in order to schedule certain functionality. But Orchestrate for integrations, when you use that template, that integration system, just like any other integration system, can be scheduled, and therefore the associated orchestration will run on that schedule.
Okay. If you do have any additional questions and we weren't able to get to them, we will have a post-webinar survey where you can leave your email and we can contact you, and we'd be happy to answer any of those questions you may have. Also, if you are one of our customers, feel free to reach out to your ACC or ICSM and they can get you answers as well. Thank you, Brent, for presenting today. We appreciate it. And thanks everyone who was able to join. We will send out the webinar recording so you can expect that. And thanks again for attending, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.